So I'm in Byford. I work for CPS Solutions. We're a pharmacy services firm. I'm not going to stand here today and talk to you a lot about OT. I'm kind of an IT guy. I'm going to talk about network segmentation, though, and some of the things. I'm also not going to really talk about technology. I'm just going to really talk about the approach. If you want to talk technology, we can. But honestly, there's so many great partners here today that you can reach out to any of them. This is what CPS Solutions does. As I said, we're pharmacy services. What we do is we'll go into a hospital and we can turnkey help that hospital run their pharmacy. We'll hire, we'll do drug ordering, we'll manage all their systems. Now, we don't actually run any of their systems, although we have several SaaS platforms that do provide help to them. Basically, what we do is hire the pharmacists and run the pharmacies. A little bit more complicated, but that's it. So let's talk about how you get here. So if you were here this morning and you saw CISA talking, you heard Clint talk about Target, imagine that you work at a large retailer and a Target breach just happened. And you're the CISO, and the next time you go to the board meeting, the board is like, could this happen to us? And they're like, of course this could happen to us. And then the heavens open and money pours forth, and now you've got all these resources to go make significant changes in security, right? And one of those changes is, well, what about our network? What do we need to do? And you start thinking about your network, and you think about all of us here probably have the same types of issues, right? You've got some legacy network in place where you've got really no long-term network strategy because of organic growth. Really, you had a difficulty anticipating future needs, mergers, acquisitions, where your growth was going to occur, what countries you were going to go into. And then in the beginning, it was just so easy, right? I've got a flat network. I've got one person. I can administer everything I want to. Now, some segmentation probably occurred as you went along. You ran into some regulations. You ran into PCI. You ran into PHI. You had your OT networks that were almost organically separated because either as you bought companies, those networks were kind of left to live out there on their own, or as you decided that, hey, you know, we own a large retail company, and that retail company has a bunch of deli scales. Do you think those deli scales are an attack vector? The answer is yes. Absolutely yes. Always yes. And you know, some financials, just some organic growth that happened as you did the network segmentation, but no real strategy behind it. And then what were the needs at the time? As I said, like PHI. Now, how did we start to address it? Because when you're given the task of going out and saying, hey, let's talk about network segmentation, depending on the size of your org, you're going to have either a huge elephant that you're going to want to eat one piece at a time, or you're going to have like a smaller cow that you're still going to eat one piece at a time. Very rarely are you going to have any type of situation where you can go address everything at the same time, no matter if you're fully cloud, no matter if you're not cloud, fully hybrid, whatever the situation is, right? And so you have to start by how are you going to identify the data, and really how are you going to tier the applications or what's within your network. That's a huge task, and it's a huge undertaking that requires a lot of expertise. And then sometimes what you'll see, especially in our case, was you look at not only the cyber risk of segmenting your network, but what's the disaster recovery? What's the business continuity plans, right? Let's say you lose one data center. That data center takes down 10,000 applications. Is that a problem? Yeah, that's a problem, right? So as you start to not only address network segmentation, now you're adding in DR, BCDR functions on top of it. So now you add in more resiliency and not just better security. As you're going along here, one of the things that you have to do is you have to think about, how do I tell this story? What story are we trying to tell, and who are we trying to tell it to? Your story really has to be really simple. It has to be better security, greater resiliency, right? And you know, a lot of the panelists today have talked about, if you're in security, how do you measure security? How do you manage the effectiveness of security? It's hard. Anybody in here that says, I've got these metrics, and these metrics tell you exactly what security tool XYZ does, I would really question them I would question them a lot on that, because I, as a CISO, when I start to report to my audit board or my board of directors, I'm always like, what's the story I'm going to tell, and how am I going to present my security metrics? Because security metrics are inherently squishy. You know what isn't squishy? Resiliency. When you can report on uptime, when we can say this system has been up 99.969, 79s, 99s, whatever nines you want to add to that, that's something you can easily report on. And when you're in an environment where maybe resiliency has been a problem in the past, that's an easy ROI. If you're in a retail environment and you've got some set of circumstances where X number of stores are down and you're losing X millions of dollars a day because they're down, and then you go and you add in some resiliency to your network, you segment those stores off, now you've got a better environment overall, you can show immediate improvement. Last year, downtime cost us this year, downtime cost us X, right? So you start to have to tell that story. And then, what's driving the conversation? Is the conversation being driven by the board? Is it being driven by kind of almost the bottoms up where the stores or the branches or the operations teams are feeling some pain and you have to go address it for them? Who are the various players? And, the other thing that I would challenge you to say is, where are you in your journey? Do you already have some segmentation? Do you have zero segmentation? Do you want to segment based on either regulatory or compliance needs? What are those different aspects that are driving the changes to your environment? And then, how do I pay for it? Nobody in this room has unlimited budget. And if you do, my resume will be on your desk. All you have to do is send me like an email and I'll just send it right out to you. And the real challenge becomes not only, how do you tell the story and how do you get the budget, but how do you buy that budget into the right stakeholders? And how do you put that budget in the right budget cycle? In my companies in the past, if you can take something and make it CapEx instead of OpEx or capital expense instead of operational expense, it's always going to be a better place, right? Some companies may be different. Some people may want that hit up front. And so they can recognize, I don't know who they are. I'd like to have a talk with them. However, and as you start having the budget discussions, as you start meeting with the stakeholders, identify the quick wins, right? If one of the first things you can do is go segment that store or that branch or that specific plant that you've been having issues with, segment that off and then show an uptime and resiliency or show a decrease in cyber events at that facility, then you've got a quick win that you can put under your belt. Show people as you go along the progress that you're making. Don't do the entire project that at the end you're going to show them one huge ROI because no one's going to buy into that. You're 5 years into it, you haven't shown them any data, but you're about to offer this huge win, they're going to cut your budget, right? So you have to work on that. And then seek multiple sources of funding. As you go into this, especially thinking at a CISO or a leadership level, when I think about how I'm going to budget something, I'm thinking about, okay, this is an HR system. How can HR help me pay for it? This is a finance system. How can finance help me pay for it? This is a business system. How can business help me pay for it? Because, again, like I said, none of us have unlimited budgets. And you really have to partner with the various stakeholders in order to get those budgets aligned, in order to get you the money that you're going to need to move the initiatives forward. I would challenge all of you that one of the things that as a leader that we have to do the most is build those relationships across the company. So when it comes to these types of conversations, whether it's budget or priority or, who are we going to put up in the beginning of the line, those are easier conversations because you already have those relationships in place. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about, we went on this network segmentation journey where I was, and it was hard. We had a lot of conversations. It took years, and even when I left, we were still working on it because it's a never-ending process. And I'll talk more about the process here in a second. But what did we do? Well, we started implementing controls. And some of those controls were as simple as new software, as new hardware, as new platforms came into the environment, how did we put them into an architectural review process? People often talk about network segmentation or other words that I'm not going to use in here, zero trust, something like that. And people look at those and they say, hey, this is just a technology to go be implemented. No, it's not. Nothing is a tool or technology in itself. You have to have the process, you have to have the people behind it in order to make anything successful. The same thing with any type of network segmentation approach. Let's say that you segmented your network today and you said, boom, network segmented. How many of your companies a year from now would have problems with that segmentation because something had been deployed that it shouldn't have? Or something had been deployed without you knowing about it, right? I would challenge that all of us have. And we did it. We implemented a variety of different ways: physical separation, virtual segmentation, We segmented at the host level. We had a lot of different tools and technologies. There was no one thing that we did that went and solved the magic bullet, right? Because every use case is going to be different. Every time you go to one of your business partners, they're going to have a little bit different view of how their specific area needs to be protected and the importance of their specific area. And as I said, it's an ongoing process, right? New implementations, policies and procedures. Do you have good policies and procedures? One of the things I've done at my last company was, or this company, the first thing we did is we went through and we reviewed all of our policies and procedures. Now, great, you've reviewed them, you've created these policies and procedures. Are people following them? Do they know where to find them? Those types of things, and are you educating people on them? Because that's just as important as anything else, because people will always do what they think is best for the company. Every team member, associate, employee, whatever you want to call the people that you work with on a daily basis, is going to do what they need to do their job and do the best they can. And sometimes that means going around the system. Do they mean to go around the system? Sometimes yes. Sometimes they just don't know any better, right? And so that's where we have to have that in place. And on top of that, we have to have a strong internal processes, right? What's our internal audit look like? How are we checking to ensure that the processes that we put in place are actually working? Are we doing security reviews? Are we looking at the items that have been implemented and taking those items and then gone back after implementation and said, check, 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 check. Yes, they answered all these questions and they did all these things. And then for, I would say, mature or advanced companies, almost everyone is going to do some type of annual pen testing, I would hope. If not, then that's your business and going about yours. But most people are going to do some type of annual pen testing. The really mature, more advanced companies are going to have some type of red team or some type of team that's going to, on an annual basis, go in and check to see that in an adversarial type of way, whether or not those controls are working. And then as you start talking about it, we completed this journey. It took us 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years. It's ongoing, whatever the story is, right? What are the benefits, right? Before, when you had this massive flat network, you had a huge attack surface, right? I've got scales in a store. I've got freezers in a store that have monitors on them. I have all these different types of devices. I've got 2.3 million devices on my network, right? And all of those devices were an attack surface. You had a difficulty with that attack surface in identifying attackers and where those attackers were using pivot points or how lateral movement was occurring within the environment, because you really couldn't track them as they crossed boundaries, right? Really few network access controls. You didn't have a lot of NAC. You didn't have a lot of, you would have some VLANs within the store, some segmentation like that, but really not as much as you would like. Outage or performance impacted a huge swath. So I'm going to tell you a story. And remember, I'm going to put my legal hat on real quick. All the stories I tell here today are fictional. They actually never occurred, and they don't represent me or any actual employer that I've ever worked with. That being said, we were implementing Office 365. And to implement Office 365 back in the day, we had to open up our border router rules to a wide segment of the network, because Microsoft really didn't give you a small list. They said, hey, here's a list of IP ranges of several thousand. Go open those up. Oh, great. So we're implementing those IP ranges, and one of the engineers puts a null value in. When he puts a null value in, every border router for one of our data centers, boom, black hole the internet. Data center's gone. Total crash. And you start thinking about network segmentation like, okay, so you lost a data center. You had 2 data centers, right? You failed over to the other data center. Absolutely. Boom, failed over just like that. How many applications do you think were in that other data center? About 10,000 weren't. Stores down, people mad everywhere. And they're like, what are you doing, Ben? I was like, don't know, right? So let's go on about our business. So that's one reason why, as you start talking about network segmentation, resiliency is such a big deal to me. That is one of the things that I would hammer home. Anything that you need in a real life story to help drive that story and help drive that engagement with your stakeholders, I would use. And then another before, really lack or define boundaries and security controls. for authentication across multiple regions, right? You could be at a store, come back to home office. You could be at the home office, going back to the store. You could be in China, hitting the U.S. You could be anywhere, and it was interesting. Now, what did it look like after? Attack surface was much smaller. Now, if you're in a large corporation, it's still huge, right? But it was much, much, much smaller. When you had the smaller attack surface, what else did that give us? When we had an attacker in there, we could limit them much more easily than we had in the past. We could look, once we identified what the attacker was doing, we could start limiting to that network. Identification is always going to be the hardest thing with an attacker in every scenario. However, it gave us a lot more flexibility. Network access controls gave us a lot more insight, a lot more control, period. You know, once we implemented NAC, once we tightened up our VLANs, once we started segmenting not only stores but different regions of stores, we had so much more control over what we could do, what we could push out, when we could push it out. And it made everything so much better from a resiliency and a security standpoint. Outage and performance impacts decreased significantly. We did not take another data center down. I'm sure all of you were happy to hear that. And those types of things are always going to be something that you can point to and say, hey, look, this is what we did. And then they're going to say, but didn't you take that data center down? Like, yeah, let's forget about that, right? And then a better user experience. A lot of times we, in security, whenever we do something, it's going to introduce friction, right? And that friction, good or bad, is going to be something that the end users feel. When you introduce that friction, how are you telling the story of what the friction looks like and why that friction is there? And how are you engaging your stakeholders? In this way, when we implemented more auth controls, specifically MFA, we made a specific challenge to go out and educate our entire user base on not only why MFA was important to them, but why MFA was going to help them personally. And so when we went to stores, we would tell stories about there are things that you never think of when you're in a home office or in an environment where you don't regularly work with stores or people at plants or people that have real life situations. So have you ever thought about someone who's in the middle of a bad relationship and whether or not that other significant person might be going online because they know each other's passwords? I know my wife's. She doesn't know mine because she never does want to try and remember them. But have you ever thought that that other person might be going online and seeing what your schedule is so that they can be at that store or at that facility when you get off? Right? What if you put an MFA token in front of that? Can they do that any longer? We found stories like that we could go and talk with our workforce with and say, hey, I know this is a real edge case, but this is how we protect you. What about your finances? What about your financial information, right? What about logging in, again, significant others or something like that? How are we protecting you and how are we protecting your paycheck, right? Because if you're reusing your password all over the world and then we're giving you the ability to go log into a system and check your bank accounts or check your pay or sign up for shifts, right? How easy would it be for someone to go in and do that? But now we've got MFA in place. So whenever you talk about the user experience and even when you add friction, if you tell the story right, you're going to not only reduce that friction a little bit, you're going to bring those users on. And then what did we learn as we went through this journey? First thing, communication is key. Talk to everyone. Talk to everyone twice and have a story. If I could go back now and revisit the beginning of what we did, I would do it all differently. And not that it wasn't successful eventually, or not that we didn't do great things. It was because we had so many things that we learned in the beginning, and that learning centered around communication and engaging the right stakeholders and telling the right story. Because we tripped over that story several times until we found what stories resonated with which stakeholders. Have a great project leader. I cannot emphasize this enough. Someone that not only has great communication skills, but they're going to be able to discuss both the technical and the business components. If you put someone out there like me that can only discuss the business components, I don't know that you're going to be successful. You have to be able to tell the technical story. You have to be able to talk to both audiences at the same time. And in our case, we found someone that had been with the organization for a very long time. They knew where the skeletons were buried. They knew where, hey, we did this in the past and it didn't work because of X, Y, Z. And so when they went and talked to that business customer said, hey, we've done this in the past and it didn't work because of X, Y, Z. Okay, well, this isn't the past and this is how it's different today. Again, someone great technology skills, great communication skills, history with the environment that could go back and have the real conversations that needed. Technology is important. Do not choose the technology and attempt to enforce it, right? Sometimes it really just needs to be a router or VLAN. Sometimes it doesn't. Sorry, Carlos, I don't need you looking at me when I say this. Sometimes it doesn't have to be SD-WAN. It doesn't have to be, application management across multiple platforms. It doesn't have to be AI or ML, right? It just has to be a router sitting somewhere that nobody else can talk to. And those are the things that you really have to understand where your business is and what is important. Because, again, you've got a plan out here, you got a store out here, stick a router in front of it, be done with it. At the same time, I would choose your partners extremely carefully. Listen to them. Tap into their expertise. Carlos is going to be up here in a minute, so I'll pick on him a little bit more. I love Carlos. I like Fortinet, but I love Carlos. I've worked with Carlos before. I know that if Carlos tells me something, I can go, oh, great, that's wonderful. He tells me sky's blue, I'm going to be like, I don't need an umbrella day. I've worked with other vendors in the past. They tell me the sky's blue. I'm going on the weather app and seeing how bad it's storming outside, right? And those are the types of decisions that you have to make. Even if I have embedded with Cisco, if maybe the relationship's not there, and I'm not trying to pick on Cisco, I could say Palo, I could say any of these other players, right? But the relationship's not there. Find people you trust to help you on this journey. Find people that are going to give you an impartial decision, impartial information that are going to help guide you in the right way. And then follow your RFI process, right? You're going to be making an investment in technology along this way. I talked about how people and processes are just important. You're not going to do something like this without technology. And how are you going to implement that technology? What's the right technology? Do you know what your RFI process is going to be? Do you know what that RFI process is going to look like? Do you know the requirements that you're going to put in place? Because you're probably going to end up having several actual different pieces of technology in that stack in order to accomplish what you want to. Some of them may be by some vendor. Some may be by another, right? You may have your branch offices with one set of firewalls, routers, SD-WAN, whatever you want to call it. You may have your data centers with another. You may have a myriad of vendors that are working together. The last panel talked about vendor partnership. That's going to be the case here. In some instances, especially if you're in a very large enterprise, you're going to have the leverage to force that vendor partnership. Or I shouldn't say force. You're going to have the leverage to encourage that vendor partnership. And I think that is my last slide. Anyway, Ben Byford, thank you. Appreciate your time today.